Hi, class. To- I'm Dr. J, and this is a continuation of our conversation and unfolding of African American history. We left off discussing Reconstruction, which followed the bloody Civil War. We spoke of Reconstruction as a betrayal of African Americans, ultimately. We think of Reconstruction as some people have called it a two-legged stool. It was able to convey the right of franchise, the right to vote to African Americans, and some social progress through education, but it fell short in providing the land for the former laborers of the land to be gainfully employed and to build their own future. So it failed in that way. We also spoke of Reconstruction as the peace that was lost after winning the war. There's an irony in that. We know that the end of Reconstruction was in 1877 with the compromise, the Wormley Compromise between the then party of Lincoln, the Republican Party, and the Democrats, who were essentially the party of the Southern Confederate States. That compromise was a betrayal of the human rights, the civil rights, the citizenship rights, and the human dignity of African Americans. When we speak of Jim Crow, also referred to as separate but equal, I think a good term for it is apartheid, because apartheid means separateness. And so separate but never equal status is what African Americans found themselves in the Southern states. And I think the best description of that status is in this quote from Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Taney, pronounced actually Tawney, in 1857, who said this: African Americans had for more than a century before been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. He was bought and sold and treated as an ordinary article of merchandise and traffic whenever a profit could be made by it. And I'll suggest that that statement is in fact the unstated motto of the former Confederate States for 100 years, beginning in 1857 until Little Rock in 1957. Summarizing Reconstruction, we know that there was conflict after the war, conflict within the Republican parties, where you had moderate Republicans who wanted to reach out to the South, have 10% of the electorate of the South swear their allegiance, Lincoln said originally to the Emancipation Proclamation after his death in 65, it was by the 14th Amendment. And as Lincoln, they wanted to treat the former Southerners leniently. These are the moderate Republicans. They wanted to admit most of them back into the Union, allow even many of the officers and elected officials, if they weren't the highest of officials, to regain office. They were against any type of military prosecution for war crimes. And they wanted to reconstruct the South as quickly and as leniently as was feasible. With Lincoln's proposals came a counter proposal from who they called the radical Republicans, only radical because they believed in emancipation during slavery, and they believed in equitable treatment of formerly enslaved Black people after slavery. And that was a radical position at that time. They pushed back against Lincoln. They were responsible for introducing the two Civil Rights Acts of 1867 and 1868. The 1867 Act sending the troops into the South to quell the violence of white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan, the White Camellias. They were responsible for wanting a more aggressive positionality with the former Confederates, under the logic that these people had gone to war with their own country. The 750,000 lives had been lost, and that there needed to be severe measures to make sure that they do not return to slavery by another name. The radicals unfortunately lost out over time. During Reconstruction, we have the issue of the Republican rule being established in the South by some Southerners who supported the party and Northerners who came South, called carpetbaggers. We know that during the rise of the Klan and other groups, there also was a rise of Black codes. There was violence not only against Black people, there was violence against anybody who supported Republican rule. And there was a counter movement by the Democratic Redeemers who wanted to return the South to its white supremacist recent past. The economics of the system was, as I said earlier, Black people did not own land. The other economic drive was that there still was money to be made from cotton. Remember, the US in 1860 is dominating the market for, international market for cotton sales, cotton production and sales, 60% of the market share. And both, there were interests in the North and the South that wanted to resume the profit margins that were being made from growing cotton. So a deal was struck in 1877 between the Northern Republicans and the Southern Democrats. And the deal, as we talked about in some detail, was that the South was going to give up the electoral votes, allow the Republicans to take the Confederacy, and to take the presidency, sorry. And in so doing, they promised to remove the federal troops from the South, which they did. And when the federal troops left the South, that is when the Redeemers gained ground. That is when we saw the evisceration of the Civil Rights Acts. Were by that time and already in the early 1870s, by July 1870, all of the former Confederate states had been readmitted back into the Union. And many former Confederate officers and so forth were coming into power. There was a brief period of time, maybe between 1865, some people say 1867, with the Civil Rights Acts and the troops in the South, and the early 70s up to maybe 72, when a lot of progress was made. We had African Americans, 700 of them holding office throughout the South. Tremendous change. We had even 16 holding federal office, 16 congressmen and 2 senators at that time. And we had these legislators working night and day to bring about change that was going to benefit not only African Americans, but all people. So some of the first legislation for public schools was introduced. Infrastructure, because the infrastructure was so dilapidated and destroyed after the war, building facilities and railroads to replace those that were destroyed during the war. And all of this development, both academically and the material development, was going to be happening in the South. These legislators were also responsible for repealing the Black codes throughout the South and other parts of the country. And of course, these reforms only angered the former Confederates and the white supremacists in the South, because not only had they lost control, but now they are losing some of their deep held cultural values that they should always be superior to Black people, and Black people should never be in a position of power over them. And so they were angered tremendously by the immediate success of African Americans during this time. Most of them, of course, free Black men who were highly educated and skilled and who rose to the occasion. The first one to enter was Rainey in early 70, and the others followed. So that information is out there for you to look at. We've talked about that compromise and what it meant in terms of a reunion between the North and the South that had an economic base around primarily cotton, but it also left the formerly enslaved African American out to dry. There was literal racial terrorism in the South. There was little action before the arrival of the federal troops that came in 67. In 1872, Congress returned full rights to the Confederate leaders. And so that was a short-lived period from 67 to 72. By 1883, you have the Supreme Court reversing the civil rights laws. By the same year, you have the case Pace versus Alabama, where the Supreme Court upheld Alabama law, which punished adultery more severely if the parties were of different races. Same year, you had the case of the United States versus Harris, where the Supreme Court declared that part of the 1871 Reconstruction Act, also called the Ku Klux Klan Act, was unconstitutional. So we have the Supreme Court stepping forward and eviscerating the Reconstruction laws during that time. And this only adds fuel to what is coming. Plessy versus Ferguson. So we've talked a little bit about this case. There's a video on it that I know many in the class have looked at, but it essentially revolved around this 1890 law called the Separate Car Act, which passed in Louisiana. And basically, it was saying that all railway companies carrying passengers in their coaches in the state shall provide equal but separate accommodations for the white and colored races. So segregate the railroad cars and provide accommodations for the Blacks. This case went all the way up to the Supreme Court because Plessy challenged it. He was a very light-skinned, biracial citizen of New Orleans, and he felt he should have a right to ride anywhere on a car that his money would allow him to ride. The case went up to the Supreme Court, and the court ruled that that the right to accommodations on railways was not protected by the 14th Amendment, right? And the 14th Amendment was that critical amendment that guaranteed citizenship. It also guaranteed that a person would not lose their life, their liberty, or their property without due process. All right, so this was the issue of liberty, something being taken away from a person. And it also held that a person will be within the jurisdiction of the states or the United States will have equal protection under the law. And so there was a question here of equal protection. And the court ruled that no, it doesn't apply here. 14th Amendment was undoubtedly to enforce the absolute equality of two races before the law, but in the nature of things, it could not have been intended to abolish distinctions based on color or to enforce social as distinguished from political equality or a commingling of the two races. And so it applied politically, but not socially. Therefore, it didn't apply to this case. And as long as the accommodations are equal, they can be separate. But there's nothing going to be equal in an area of the country where people believe that there are no rights that a Black person has that a white man must respect. Justin Harlan consented to the Plessy decision. He said, "Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. In respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law. The present decision, it may well be apprehended, will not only stimulate aggressions more or less brutal and irritating upon the admitted rights of colored citizens, but will encourage the belief that it is possible to defeat the beneficent purposes which the people of the United States had in view when they adopted the recent amendments of the Constitution." So he's saying that you're really violating the spirit of the 14th Amendment with this law, but it was in step with the spirit of the time, which was reconciliation between the North and the South and turning the South back over to the former Confederates. And they needed someone to blame for their shameful defeat in the war, for the devastation of their portion of the country in the war, for the disproportionately high death toll that they experienced in the war, and their refusal to accept responsibility for being an abject violation to every principle under the sun. And so they turned on Black people. And there was systematic targeting on the order of a couple of lynchings a week for about 80 years in the South, 2 a week for 80 years. People that lived during that time knew somebody who was being lynched. Some of the early research during that time out of Tuskegee University came up with numbers of people who had been died and lynched, and then those numbers have been adjusted over time. But there were lynchings primarily in the southern states and in the border states around the South. And lynchings were public events where men, women, and children attended because they were a form of ritualized violence that reinforced white supremacy. And it wasn't just lynching people, people were brutalized. As you all know, if you look at the Without Sanctuary information that's been provided, it'll let you know that people were taking souvenirs of people's bodies. They were taking pictures and putting them on postcards and sending them back home to their relatives, bragging about having attended this particular lynching. And the other point that we know is that in many cases, these lynchings were a matter of social control and establishing ritualistic dominance and had nothing to do with right or wrong. And they certainly were all lawless because a lynching by definition happens without a trial. So African Americans lost political power after Plessy and Ferguson. They lost the right, the franchise to vote. If you look at voting amongst African Americans in the 1880s, you find that the percentage of eligible voters who voted is around 80%. And when you look at 1910, it's under 10%. And so absolute disenfranchisement. And that 10% who voted were typically being told who to vote for and only voting in the general election. And of course, they never had economic power. And because of the cynical nature of Plessy versus Ferguson, they were always in dilapidated and inferior accommodations with respect to whites. They had to pay poll taxes when they didn't have jobs to earn the money to feed themselves. They were given literacy tests that would ask them to recite a portion of the Constitution, and sometimes the person doing the asking themselves was illiterate and would assess whether or not the literate person actually was literate. That's how insane it was. And then, of course, things like, well, if your grandfather voted, basically right after slavery, then you can vote. And of course, grandfathers were illiterate right after slavery. They were not voting. And so the people were summarily overruled. So anything that they could do to keep people from the polls was done. And the most common tool was violence. Some more recent research has said that just looking at the 11 Confederate states and Kentucky, which was a border state, there were about actually 4,075 lynchings during that period of time between 1877 and 1950. And this is about 800 more than was reported by Tuskegee. And so it was even on a higher clip than 2 a week. Massacres were occurring. People were being driven out of towns. They were being driven out of the legislatures, like in Georgia. Georgia was the last state to be admitted, of the Confederate States, but it was admitted actually into the Union twice during the Reconstruction period. It was admitted in 69, and then it came in late 70 because it kicked all of the Black people out of office, right, in the state at one time. And then it had to resubmit its application to be admitted back into the Union. Same thing happened in Wilmington, where the elected officials were summarily run out of town. Many of them were killed. It's not known exactly what the actual numbers were, but they disenfranchised all the elected officials in Wilmington, North Carolina at one time, and they had to leave town under fear of death in 1898. These things were happening in Florida, they were happening in Alabama, they were happening in North Carolina, they were happening throughout the South. Why? The federal troops had left. And the Redeemers wanted to redeem white supremacy. And white supremacy meant that Black people were going to be put back into their place, and they were going to be put there immediately and under force of death. And the sad piece around this is that there was no one there to fight for them other than themselves. There was no local police, and many times the local police were the lynchers. There was no state police. Many times the state police were the people who were keeping them from fleeing to the north and returning them back to the sharecrops. There was no US troops sent in because the complicity of the Republican Party at that time was not going to upset the power balance and the relationship that they had garnered with the Southern Democrats by removing the troops. So Black people had to respond, and they responded in many different ways. And of course, one was to fight back. And fighting with the word, fighting with the mind, fighting with political argument, and fighting in many different venues, fighting with the pen. Frederick Douglass was in the forefront of this fight from the time he was emancipated. He was agitating for the full equity of the Black man with the white man as an American. He, as you know, was a leading abolitionist, and afterwards he was a leading warrior in the cause of freedom and justice for Black people. W.E.B. Du Bois is another one down here who also believed that Black people had to agitate. They had to demand their freedom because they were Americans. They had paid the price, right, to live in dignity in this country, and that the only way that they were going to realize it was to fight for it, because it wasn't going to be given to them under the circumstances of white supremacy in the society. Ida B. Wells, well, we know a little bit about her story, but her parents, again, were slaves, were enslaved people. And afterwards, when she was just a teenager, her parents and one of her siblings died, and disease, yellow fever, I believe, and she had to take over raising her family. They wanted to separate her family. She wouldn't allow them to raise her family, and so she misrepresented her age. She was very brilliant and became a school teacher to support her family. In the course of traveling back and forth on the train, when she was told that she couldn't ride in the white car and she had to ride in the smoker, well, she was always dressed nicely because she was a school teacher and she was a cultured young woman, and she didn't want to ride in the smoker because that's where all the soot came, and that was the black car right behind the engine. And so they had to forcibly put her off the train. Her response to that was to sue the train company. She won her suit. At the local level, it was overturned in a higher court, but that was Ida. So Ida agitated. We'll come back to her again because she used many different tactics. She's one of the early activists who introduced many of the tactics that you're going to see later in the civil rights movement. Booker T. Washington took another position. He took the position of accommodation, feeling that Black people were going to gain their ground in the South by casting their bucket down, putting in the work, and then making themselves indispensable to the Southern economy. And then through that, they would gain their dignity. And so he, after he graduated from Hampton Industrial School, he went to Alabama. He was one of the early founders of Tuskegee University. He was their first, what they call principal at the time, like a president now. And he finished his life there as president of Tuskegee. But in the meantime, he did a lot of other things. He established Black businesses, Black Business League, and so forth. But politically, he discouraged Black people from agitating, and he also tried to undermine those that were agitating because he was quite popular and powerful, particularly with the Southern power structure and also Northern industrialists who supported the whole notion of Negro industrial schools and Negroes staying out of the political realm and just contributing to the economy. And then you had the third move was the exodusters like Pap. And Pap Singleton said, we just leave. We don't have to stay here and be denigrated in this manner. It's a large country. Let's just go. We'll head west, right? We'll go out and try our luck in the Midwest. And those are called the exodusters because they're going out into dusty like Oklahoma, Kansas, and Nebraska, and so forth. And so those were three of the major responses during the time. And Ida B. Wells also was an exoduster. And so when her godson was lynched, right, in Memphis, she organized Black people in Memphis to just summarily get up, pack up, and leave Memphis and head west, right? And so she used whatever tactic was going to work, and a combination of tactics worked for her. And there were, of course, by 1919, we had Red Summer, but prior to Red Summer, there were a series of race riots in the South. And in these race riots, in many of them, the African American community was targeted. In all of them, the African American community was targeted. In some instances, parts of their community were destroyed and they were run out of town. We talked about Wilmington. In other times, people were killed, and in other areas, like Tulsa, the entire community was attacked and burned and even bombed with airplanes at the time, leading right up to Detroit in the 40s. And so you had a history of attacks on African Americans. You had Black codes, which were limiting their freedom, their movement, and forcing them into a very segregated, confined space to be exploited as cheap labor and to be manipulated for the whims of those who are in power. In 1919, they called it the Red Summer because there were so many different riots throughout primarily northern cities. And this had to do with the soldiers coming back from World War II, the Black soldiers who in many places fought back when they were attacked. And you found this wave of violence. There were 26 race riots during that year. And these are some of the places that they occurred. And more than 100 Blacks killed and thousands were wounded and left homeless as a result of this. Because the typical scenario was there was some incident that made the press that claimed that Black people had either assaulted a white woman or were organizing to attack white people. Those were the two most popular ruses that were used. Ida B. Wells, in her Red Journal, when she went back and investigated lynchings, and she dispelled the idea that all these white women were being attacked. She said one of the things that she noticed was disproportionate success of the men who were being accused of making attacks. So men who had, like her young, men who had defied the odds were often the ones in these small towns who were being targeted. They had the most to lose, right? And then there was never another witness. There was no evidence. There was no trial. There was just a rush to judgment. But what she uncovered was that there was this tendency, even when there was just an association between a Black male and a white woman. Sometimes she would yell rape. She would claim rape when they were discovered, right? Or people would claim that it had to have been a rape because the two of them were together. So just the association itself fell into the category of rape, right? And so there was just terrorism that was happening against Black people. Rape was the most common ruse. But as I said before, that if you want to look at the issue of the rape culture in America, you needn't look at African Americans. You need to look at, for instance, African American lineage. Most African Americans descend from European male lines. Most of us, right, have Y DNA coming from Europe. So the rapists were not the African Americans. The Ida B. Wells, again, this is her story. You can look at it. She's fabulous and so forth. I think one of the most interesting things about her was how she was fearless, right? She went in and actually confronted two different presidents about their policies, Woodrow Wilson and McKinley. She went to her pen and published in the newspaper exposing the fact that rape was being used as a ruse, right, to disenfranchise successful Black people. She wrote about the fact that they were disproportionately targeting successful Black people and so forth. Many times she had to do so under a pseudonym, under another name, because she wanted to survive, but she was literally fearless, and she was highly, highly capable. While she was teaching, she noticed that there was differential in pay between white and black teachers, and she fought against that. I talked about the instance when she was dragged from a train and when her young friend was lynched. She occupied Memphis. She became familiar with the literary society. She wrote essays. She became prominent member of the newspaper, which was called Free Speech. And even with her life threatened, right, she continued to write. She had to flee the South. And then she was called back into Arkansas and other places in the South and returned to do political work with folks. Booker T, born a slave, educated at Hampton, and then helped one of the founders of Tuskegee, the lifelong principal or president of Tuskegee, founded the National Negro Business League. And really, we have to think of these leaders during this time in a complex way. We can reduce them to, oh, he's a good one, he's a bad one, and so forth, but that's missing something. I think it's better to look at the strengths and weaknesses of each of them, and also examine the backgrounds and the context in which they existed. And so the notion in a white supremacist South that one is going to have to accommodate vigilante terrorism to some degree is not unreasonable. Everybody had to accommodate that situation to some degree, right? We can have a conversation about where to draw the lines, but there were very clear lines that were being drawn, and there was a very low tolerance for anybody who violated their place, who stepped out of pace or got out of place. And so we have to think of accommodation in that way. Also, Tuskegee was an attempt to teach Black people skills that were going to allow them to be successful. True that many of the skills that were being taught are going to be replaced by mechanization. And so they were learning skills that were not going to be marketable in many cases. However, some of them were, like, raising bees and making honey, as an example. Animal husbandry, right? Well, true that the horse is going to be replaced by the car. And so it's not a skill that is going to be as marketable at the turn of the century as one would have hoped. And so the blacksmith shops were an attempt to teach a skill, but they were not in step with the pace of mechanization and the technological innovations that were happening in society. Booker T's approach made him have the ear of presidents. And so he was invited to dinner with Teddy Roosevelt in the White House in 1901. And he advised President Taft, who is said to have actually read his book, Up from Slavery. Washington wanted to give an address at the 1895, it's like the World's Fair at the Negro Pavilion. And so many Blacks were protesting the fact that this fair was going to be segregated. And, Washington said, well, the society's segregated. And so let's make the best of the situation. Let's have our own segregated pavilion and show that what we are doing as a people. And that was boycotted by some of the more progressive Blacks, like Du Bois and so forth. But it was the way in which he tried to take what was given and make something out of it. He urged both Southern Blacks and whites to cast down their bucket where they are and to rebuild the South. And then he had this image of the hand, and he would say, in all things social, we can be separate, right? But in those things essential to mutual progress, we come together and work together as a people. The industrialists like this. A lot of the barons of industry like this concept. But for a lot of progressive Black people during the time, it was selling out. It was saying that we shouldn't be advocating for our full human rights, our full civil rights, our full rights that we deserve as Americans, particularly as a people who have contributed so long and so hard and so prosperously to this nation. So, and then you have Booker T trying to make his counter arguments, right? You got to start from the bottom. You got to work yourself up. You got to accept Jim Crow. Don't agitate. Don't make already hostile people more hostile, and so forth. And Du Bois is saying nonsense, right? Now he's not born in the South, right? He's not um, raised in the South like Washington. He comes from almost a middle class family in Massachusetts. And he went to good schools when he was young. And he wanted to go to Harvard because he was very bright. He talks about encountering racism at the age of 10 with his classmates and how it motivated him to always show that he was superior in every way to them. And he had this intellect that where he was allowed to make that come true. How Harvard wouldn't accept his application, so he ended up going to Fisk, which was the Harvard of Black schools at the time in Tennessee, and he excelled. And then he became a teacher. He got a degree in sociology, and then he went out and he taught. And he taught in poor rural schools, and he got a real sense of what the South was all about. And it allowed him to then think about what is needed to uplift Black people. And he started devoting his academic life to doing this. He did some real fantastic work in sociology, and some people recently have identified him as the father of modern sociology, because some of the theories in modern sociology were first articulated by Du Bois, particularly in his work on the Philadelphian Negro. That was his graduate dissertation, where he really used scientific methodology that he had learned in Germany, and he was applying it to the field of sociology here in the States, and it was more advanced than anything else going on here in the States. So Du Bois is this huge intellect. He is impatient with the idea of having to wait for your full rights, and believes that without demanding them, you're never going to receive them. Very similar to Frederick Douglass, right? Without a struggle, nothing is gained. This was his perspective. And so he rolled up his sleeves and got involved. And he's going to attend Harvard and be the first African-American PhD at Harvard. And he worked in multiple disciplines, right? But in sociology was his degree. But he ended up being so frustrated with the US that he immigrates to Ghana, and he lives out his life and actually dies in Ghana. But while he's there, he's not just sort of escaping America, he's reaching out and helping to establish Pan-African movement between Blacks throughout the diaspora. So he's one of the founders of the Pan-African movement. He also was a founder of the Niagara Movement, which was a progressive Black movement founded in 1905. And Du Bois was right there in the middle of it. They were advocating for economic justice, freedom of speech, full access to education, fully protective rights to vote, and an end to racial discrimination in all aspects of life, employment, housing, facilities, and so forth. So it's a very progressive movement that he helped to establish. And out of that movement, some of them went in to found the NAACP. So when there was an opportunity to meet with a broader group, Du Bois went in and met with them around the Springfield riot. And they formed an organization that was a multiracial, also multi-gendered organization. And Du Bois actually became the editor of their main publication called Crisis. But their stated goal was to secure for all people the rights guaranteed in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. They established a national office in New York. They had a white constitutional lawyer originally as their president. Their next president is going to be actually a Black person. Du Bois was the only African-American among the organization's executives initially, and he was the editor of Crisis Magazine. And he worked in Crisis Magazine until they were trying to curtail what he was printing. And particularly he was printing anti-war, taking anti-war positions. He was against Black people participating in the First World War. He had also joined the Communist Party. And he ended up leaving the NAACP for his advocacy. He wrote The Souls of Black Folks, one of the textbooks that we use in this class, which is still relevant today, because he says that the problem of the 20th century is the color line. And we could say the same thing about the 21st century, that the color line is still a George Floyd issue. The colorblind is still prevalent. You know, Breonna Taylor, it's still, the line is there. The restrictive covenants, segregated communities, disproportionate treatment of people on different sides of the line. Du Bois attacked Washington as an accommodationist. He said, when Mr. Washington apologizes for injustice, he does not rightly value the privilege and duty of voting, belittles the emasculating effects of caste distinctions, and opposes the higher training and ambition of our brighter minds. We must unceasingly and firmly oppose him. And so he advocated more for Tyler X. He said that in all societies, it is their educated leaders who, it is the educated group who lead people forward. This is Crisis Magazine that he was the editor of, and it was a very progressive voice, and it still holds its own in terms of the quality of the editorial and the scholarly quality of the publications, even to this day. But basically advocating for democracy to be realized by all people in this society, and people of color deserve it. The NAACP was busy. They have a legal defense fund. They also were fighting cases in schools long before Brown. So in the 30s, you had Gaines v. Canada. This is a case in Missouri where they were arguing that there should be equal educational facilities at the college university level for Blacks and for whites. The defense fund established under Thurgood Marshall, who you know is going to go on to be the chief. He's going to be the chief lawyer in the Brown versus Board of Education case in '54, and go on to be our first African-American Supreme Court justice. Supreme Court, I mean, the NAACP in 1948, you have Sepuel in Oklahoma, Board of Regents, again, states must admit qualified African-Americans in all white graduate schools if no Black schools exist. And so kind of working around this separate but equal issue and using it kind of against racism to sort of say, if you haven't provided a separate college for Black people, then you have to admit them into graduate school in your colleges and so forth, because the Supreme Court said you can have segregation, but you have to have separate but equal. And of course, it is extremely expensive to have a mirror image school for Black people, right? For med school, for law school, for whatever graduate study that they're going into. And so this was kind of the precursor to the integration that they were pushing for, is that they were showing how illogical and how expensive it is going to be to try to maintain two separate, racially separate systems. Shelley versus Kramer Again, they're focusing on restrictive covenants. And this is something that we're going to have to leave for now, but dig much deeper into later. But these were mainly directed at housing, and they were restricting where African Americans could live. And these covenants were placed into residential deeds and mortgages, and they were also placed into, corporate and plats of land. If you wanted to develop a plat of land, sometimes the covenant would be there when you purchased the land. You had to agree not to build any units on the land that were going to rent, buy, sell to people of color, and keep those units exclusively white. And these came into really existence right after the turn of the century, more in the early 1920s. And the issue around them is something that is ongoing, right? And so A. Philip Randolph actually criticized both Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. He was to the left of both of them. He was a socialist. In 1925, he founded the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. So he was able to unionize the porters working on trains serving white people. And he upgraded their conditions, he upgraded their pay, and he made it one of the best jobs that blue collar jobs that a Black person could have during that time. He secured contracts with the Pullman Company, and so the porters that worked on these elite Pullman cars, they were like the Cadillac of train travel, were all Black men, and they were getting paid top dollar. They also were going in and out of the South and taking information into the South, and many of the his newspaper, for instance, The Messenger, was being delivered in the South, which was telling Black people to leave and migrate to the North where they could get better paying jobs. But he's, again, a person who agitated. He was a tremendous politician, really, an activist. And one of the things that he did is he threatened a march on Washington under FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, forcing him to issue Executive Order 8802, which opened up the jobs during the Second World War. It was called the Fair Employment Act. So let me get these things straight. So during the Second World War, he was able to lobby for the Fair Employment Act in 48. He pressured Truman, who issued Executive Order 9981, desegregating the military. So the military is desegregating before the society at large. It's just desegregating in 48, and the society really doesn't begin until the 50s, but the pressure was placed by A. Philip Randolph. And he also organized the March on Washington in 1963. He was the primary organizer of the March on Washington. And he played a pivotal role, because when the Young Lions, like in SNCC with John Lewis, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, wanted to vehemently criticize President Kennedy, that was going to be their platform, very different than what Martin Luther King was saying in the I Have a Dream speech and so forth. A. Philip Randolph stepped in and was able to get them to kind of speak with one voice and to tone down their rhetoric for the moment and make the argument later, but not at that particular moment. And they listened to him because he had the credentials of credibility by being in the movement for so long and making such significant contributions. So I will stop there with Mary Bethune. I didn't know where I was going to stop, but you can't ignore her. So Mary Bethune Cookman was tremendous. She also has a resume that is difficult, and you have to kind of read it to believe it, right? But she's born the 15th of 17 children to slave parents. In 1904, she opened a high school, a hospital, and a normal industrial school for Negro girls. That normal industrial school for Negro girls then merged in 1923 into Bethune-Cookman College, one of the historically Black colleges in Florida. In 1924, she helped to found the National Association for Colored Women. In 1935, she founded the National Council of Negro Women. Between 36 and 43, she worked for FDR. She was in the presidential cabinet. They called it the Black Cabinet. She was director of the National Youth Administration's Division on Negro Affairs, leading advisor to President FDR, part of his Black Cabinet on minority affairs and interracial relations. She was a very close friend of Eleanor Roosevelt. They hung out together. And many of Eleanor Roosevelt's ideas about race relations came from her or would be run by her before Eleanor Roosevelt would take an action. She was vice president of the NAACP in 1940, and she served on President Truman's committee from 12 on national defense. And so an amazing career, an activist of the First Order, and a person who really knew how to work within the system at the highest levels and to be able to influence decision-making at that level and to build institutions, right, that were going to uplift and going to educate. So that is the proper end. Anything beyond that is going to be frightening because I don't know where it's coming from. And I just want to thank everybody. Be well, stay well, and we'll talk more later.